The day Petra Calloway buried her father, her husband showed up with another woman on his arm. Not a colleague, not a family friend. Everyone in that church knew exactly who Sable Whitmore was. The woman Jonah Calloway had been seen with at the Ritz-Carlton bar 3 Fridays in a row. The woman whose name had been whispered to Petra by 2 different people over the past year. The woman she had chosen, in her quiet and calculated way, to say nothing about, not yet. Petra stood at the entrance of St. Andrew's Presbyterian in Oakville, Ontario, shaking hands with her father's friends, accepting hugs from cousins she hadn't seen in years, watching people sign the condolence book in the lobby with their careful, looping handwriting. She was wearing a black wool coat her father had always liked. He used to say it made her look like a woman who had somewhere important to be. She thought about that as she watched Jonah walk through the double doors with Sable Whitmore, his hand resting on the small of Sable's back. Sable was wearing ivory, cream technically, but close enough to white that 3 of Petra's aunts turned to look. She was visibly pregnant, perhaps 6 months, perhaps 7, and she moved through the church with the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she had already won something. Petra didn't cry. She had done her crying the week before, alone in her father's study at the house in Burlington, going through his papers. She had cried for the right reasons, in private, where no one could use it against her. What she felt now, watching her husband guide another woman to a pew on the left side of her father's church, was something much colder and much more useful than grief. She felt absolutely certain. Her father, Douglas Hargrove, had built Hargrove Environmental Consulting over 31 years. He had started with 1 truck, a small office above a dry cleaner on Brant Street, and 2 contracts with the regional municipality of Halton. He had been methodical, private, and almost aggressively unglamorous about it. He drove a 2009 Silverado until the transmission failed. He ate the same lunch most days, a sandwich from the place on James Street that he'd been going to since 1994. He came home at 6:30 every night when Petra was growing up, and he helped her with her chemistry homework, even though he was an engineer, not a chemist, and his explanations were often circular and sometimes wrong. She had adored him completely. By the time he died, suddenly, a cardiac event, a Tuesday morning in March, no warning. Hargrove Environmental had 17 full-time employees, consulting contracts with 4 municipalities, and a long-standing relationship with a provincial environmental review board that generated steady, unglamorous, reliable work. Douglas had also, quietly and without fanfare, made several very good investments in commercial real estate, in Hamilton and Stony Creek over the years. He had a particular fondness for small industrial properties that everyone else ignored. He had been, as Petra would later describe it to her lawyer, a quiet man who understood that patience was the most underrated form of power. She was her father's daughter. Petra had met Jonah Calloway at a conference in Toronto 8 years ago. She was 32, working as a senior environmental assessor for a firm in Mississauga. He was charming in the way that men who have learned how to be charming often are. Immediately attentive, good at listening, skilled at making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was in financial advisory work. He wore his suits well. He knew which restaurants to suggest. They married 2 years later at a small ceremony in the Niagara Peninsula. 50 guests, a winery. Late September, when the leaves were just starting to turn. Her father gave a toast that made half the room laugh and the other half reach for a tissue. Jonah's parents flew in from Calgary. It was, by most visible measures, a good day. The problems did not begin immediately. They rarely do. They began in small ways that Petra noticed, but did not catalog. Because she was busy, and because she trusted her own judgment, and because she had no reason, at the time, to believe she was wrong. Jonah's work hours lengthened. His phone became something he kept face down. He started going to the gym in the evenings instead of the mornings, which was a small change, but a specific one. Because people who go to the gym in the evenings are usually trying to look a certain way for someone they're going to see. She was not naive. She had simply been deciding. The name Sable Whitmore came to her from a colleague at a joint project meeting in Hamilton. Not in any dramatic way, just a quiet aside, a look, the kind of thing women do for each other when they're trying to give information without making a scene. Petra thanked her colleague, went home, made dinner, and said nothing. That was 18 months ago. What Jonah did not know, and what Petra had been quietly ensuring he would not know until the exact moment she chose to tell him, was the structure of her father's estate. Douglas Hargrove had updated his will 2 years before his death, after a conversation with Petra that began as a dinner and turned into something longer, something more careful. They had sat at the kitchen table in Burlington until almost midnight, talking about the business, about the properties, about what her father wanted to happen. He had been the one to bring up the trust. His lawyer, a woman named Frances Odiano, who had offices on John Street in Hamilton, had advised him on the structure. Petra had sat across from him, and she had listened, and at the end of it her father had said, "I just want to make sure it's yours, and stays yours." Under the terms of Douglas Hargrove's estate, everything passed to Petra through a discretionary family trust with very specific provisions. The trust assets, which included the consulting business, the commercial properties, and a portfolio of investment accounts that totaled, at the time of his death, approximately $4.2 million, were classified as inherited property, received through a trust instrument, and were explicitly structured to remain Petra's separate property under the terms of the trust deed. Frances Otieno had been very thorough. In Ontario, inherited property received through a trust is generally excluded from the calculation of net family property for the purposes of equalization under the Family Law Act. This is not a loophole. It is not a trick. It is simply how the legislation works. And Douglas Hargrove's lawyer had made sure the paperwork said exactly what it needed to say. Jonah was not a lawyer. He was a financial advisor. He understood money in a certain way, how to move it, how to talk about it, how to make it sound larger than it was. He did not understand it the way Frances Odiano understood it. This would matter later. The reception after the funeral was held at Petra's parents' house. Her mother, Vera, had died when Petra was 19, so it was the house she thought of as her father's house, the one with the silver birches in the front yard and the flagstone walkway he had installed himself. One summer, in the late 90s, when he decided he was going to learn masonry. He had not been good at masonry. The walkway was slightly uneven and would shift a little every spring with the frost heave, and he had found this funny rather than frustrating. Petra moved through the reception on autopilot, accepting food she didn't eat, talking to people she hadn't spoken to in years. Her father's business partner, Gordon, shook her hand with both of his and told her Douglas had been the most honest man he'd ever worked with. Her cousin from Guelph told a story about a camping trip in Algonquin Park in 1987 that made everyone laugh. The afternoon light came through the windows at a low angle and turned everything amber. Jonah circulated through the room as if he were at a networking event. He was good at that, working a room, knowing when to offer a comment, when to listen, when to refresh a drink. Sable Whitmore was not there. She had not come to the reception. Whether this indicated some last-minute sense of restraint or simply logistics, Petra neither knew nor particularly cared. At one point, Jonah came to stand beside her near the fireplace. "How are you holding up?" he said, which was the thing people say. "Fine," Petra said, which was also the thing people say. She watched him drift toward Gordon, introduce himself, begin the particular kind of conversation that Jonah always had with men who ran businesses. Attentive, interested, subtly angling. She had watched him do this many times over the years. She understood it better now than she had before. She went to find Frances Otieno, who was standing near the dining room table with a cup of tea. "Tuesday," Frances said quietly. "Tuesday is fine," Petra said. She filed for divorce 6 weeks after the funeral. She did not tell Jonah in advance. She did not have a dramatic confrontation. She did not wait for him to come home and then stand in the kitchen, holding her evidence while he tried to explain. Those scenes exist in movies and in certain kinds of stories, where the point is the confrontation itself. Petra had never been interested in the confrontation. She was interested in the outcome. The documents were served to Jonah at his office on a Wednesday morning in early May, when the lilacs were blooming along the back fence of the house in Oakville they had bought together 3 years into their marriage. She had thought about that, the lilacs, when she made the decision about timing. Her father had planted a row of lilacs at the Burlington house because her mother had loved them. She had always associated the smell with something that couldn't be taken from her. Jonah called her 11 times in the 3 hours after the documents were served. She let it go to voicemail. His lawyer contacted Frances Odieno the following week, and then the week after that, and then a third time, with what Petra could only describe as escalating confidence. The initial communications were professional. The second wave was pointed. The third arrived with a letter outlining Jonah's position on what he believed he was entitled to from the estate of Douglas Hargrove. He believed he was entitled to a significant share of it. This was, to put it plainly, incorrect. Petra sat in Francis Odieno's office on a Thursday afternoon in June, reading through the response letter that Francis had drafted. It was precise and dry in the way that legal correspondence is when the writer knows they're right. Francis had been practicing family law in Hamilton for 22 years. She had the particular calm of someone who had seen this exact situation, or something very close to it, many times before. He's going to argue that he contributed to the appreciation of the trust assets, Francis said. That's the angle. He'll claim his advice, his involvement, his influence on your management decisions, all of that. He wasn't involved in any of it, Petra said. I know. And we have that in writing, because your father's trust deed is very clear about who the trustee is, who the beneficiary is, and what role, if any, a spouse has in the administration. Which is none. Francis paused. He didn't sign anything. He didn't have power of attorney. He was never listed as a joint account holder on any of the estate assets. Petra nodded. My father was thorough. Your father's lawyer was thorough, Francis said, with the smallest possible smile. Your father just had the good sense to hire the right one. The letter also addressed the matrimonial home, the Oakville property, purchased jointly, mortgaged jointly, appreciating jointly. That one was legitimately shared and would be divided accordingly. Petra had known this from the beginning and had factored it in. The Oakville house was worth just under $900,000. After the mortgage, there was perhaps $550,000 in equity to divide. She had already identified a condo on the lakeshore in Oakville, closer to the water, smaller, entirely her own. She had walked through it twice. Jonah's lawyer pushed back for 4 months. It was, in its way, an education. Petra watched the argument evolve and then contract. The claim about his contribution to the estate's appreciation was difficult to sustain because there was nothing on paper. The claim that the trust assets should be included in net family property ran directly into the language of the trust deed and the provisions of the Family Law Act. The claim that the commercial properties were somehow jointly managed fell apart when it became clear that Jonah had never been to any of them, did not know their addresses, and could not name a single tenant. He knew they existed. He had, at various dinners over the years, referred to Petra's family properties in the vague and confident way people reference things they believe they will one day benefit from. But knowing that a thing exists is not the same as having a claim to it. In October, his lawyer sent a revised proposal. It was substantially reduced from the original position. Francis Otieno sent back a counter. In November, they settled. Petra received the equity from the matrimonial home, which she was already expecting. She received the condo on the lakeshore, which she had already picked out. She received the full benefit of her father's trust untouched, as it had always been, and as Douglas Hargrove had always intended. Jonah received his personal accounts, his car, and a smaller check than he had been anticipating. The thing that Petra thought about afterward, in the weeks and months following the settlement, unpacking boxes in the new condo, hanging the framed aerial photograph of Burlington that had been in her father's study, was not the money. It was not the outcome, exactly. It was a specific moment at the funeral, standing at the entrance of St. Andrew's Presbyterian, shaking hands with her father's friends, watching Jonah walk through the double doors. She had felt absolutely certain, and she had not known then, whether that certainty was grief or clarity, or something else entirely. She understood now that it was simply her father, still teaching her, not with words, and not with the uneven flagstone walkway, and not even with the trust deed and the provisions in the language that Francis Odieno had made sure said exactly what it needed to say. With something older and simpler than any of that, he had known that patience was the most underrated form of power, and he had spent 31 years proving it. And then he had left everything he'd built to the person he trusted most to understand that. The lilacs came back in May, the same as they always did. They didn't care who had been there the spring before, or what had changed, or what had been taken and what had been kept. They just bloomed, the same pale purple they had always been. And the smell came through the window of the new condo on a Tuesday morning. And Petra put down her coffee and stood at the window for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. She had somewhere important to be. She was in no hurry to get there.